I've been sharing my painting journey here for a little while now, and today I thought I'd try something a little different, a tutorial style video. Toward the end, I also share a few tips and some thoughts on what I might improve next time, so feel free to stick around for that if you're curious. This is a full-length tutorial, made so you can paint along with me in real time. It's especially beginner-friendly if you're just starting out or want to go at a slower pace. If you're short on time or just want a quicker overview, I've also made a shorter version. You can find the link in the top right corner. I started with a really quick pencil sketch, nothing too detailed, just enough to mark out the horizon line, the shapes of the mountains, where the reflections would go, and a rough idea of where the trees needed to be. It would just give me a bit of structure before laying down the first wash. I try to keep it really light so it won't show through the paint later on. Drawing the reflections kind of feels like drawing everything upside down. It can be a little tricky at times, especially when you're trying to make it symmetrical. I try not to overthink it too much, just focusing on matching the general shape and keeping the edges soft usually works well. There's a small island here with a few trees growing from it. I'm just blocking in the shape first. Let me just quickly show you what I'm using. This is the Winsor & Newton Cotman set of 40 colors, and I've also added their metallic set of 8 pans in here as well. I've labeled all the colors with a small labeler, and usually I just take out the ones I need for a particular painting. These are the brushes I use the most. They're also Winsor & Newton Cotman that range from size 0 to 10. If you're interested, I've added a few Amazon affiliate links in the description. I earn a small commission if you decide to use them. For the first wash, I'm wetting the paper thoroughly, the whole page for this painting. I've learned from experience that it's really easy to miss a few dry patches. Now I always check it from the side to make sure it's evenly wet before I start. It just helps the paint flow more smoothly and avoids any unexpected hard edges. This 300 GSM paper absorbs quite a bit of water. It's always good to check that the surface is shiny, but not too many pools of water. First up, I'm laying down a wash of cadmium yellow hue using a big soft brush. This one is a size 10. I'm starting near the horizon where the light is strongest, just letting the color flow gently across the damp paper. Next, I'm adding some cadmium red pale hue just above the yellow, letting the two colors meet and gently mingle together on the paper. I'm not overworking the blend, just letting the wet surface do most of the work for that soft, glowing transition in the sky. Now I'm adding a little alizarin crimson hue, really diluted with plenty of water. The first wash doesn't need to be too intense, I'm just building up these soft sunset tones gradually, keeping everything nice and light at this stage. The paper is still nice and wet at this stage, so the colors are blending together really smoothly. I'm just letting them settle into each other without too much fuss. That softness is exactly what I'm after here. When I paint reflections, I try to make sure they are a little darker than the sky above. They actually appear that way in real life, especially on still water. So I'm using slightly more pigment here just to give the reflection a bit more weight and depth. I'm adding a bit more cadmium red here to deepen the color, but I'm being careful not to cover up too much of that yellow. I still want that warm glow to come through near the horizon. Sometimes the brush holds a little too much water. When that happens, I just dab it gently on a tissue or paper towel to take off the excess. It gives me a bit more control, especially when I'm working in areas where I don't want too much paint spreading around. Just blending gently where the two meet so it stays soft and gradual. I'm adding a bit more yellow here. As I build up the oranges and reds, the yellow started looking a little too muted. Just refreshing it up a bit helps bring back that glow and keep the warmth near the horizon balanced. I'm just continuing to build up the colors now, layering a little more of each to bring in some extra vibrancy. I'm still keeping things soft, but these extra layers really help the sunset feel more alive and glowing. I'm dabbing off a little paint in a few areas to let some light show through the clouds. The paper is still wet, so it's easy to lift the color gently. It's a nice way to bring some softness and subtle glow without adding more paint. I'm just touching up a few little spots where there's a bit too much white showing through. It really feels like an iterative process, adding a bit of color, stepping back, softening something, then layering a little more. It doesn't have to be perfect all at once. It just slowly comes together with each pass. I'm letting the paper dry now and using a hair dryer to speed things up a bit. I'm in Australia and it's winter here at the moment, so things take a little bit longer to dry than usual. Just making sure it's completely dry before moving on to the next layer helps avoid any unwanted blending. Moving on to the mountains, I'm mixing a bit of alizarin crimson with intense blue to get a nice muted purple for the distant shapes. Oops, that came out a little stronger than I meant. Let's try again. That's much better. I find using a little test card really helpful. It lets me see the exact colour of the mix before it goes on the paper. Sometimes the colour looks quite different on the palette, so this just gives me a bit more control and confidence before I commit. I'm starting with the distant mountains first, using a size 4 brush and a fairly diluted mix. I want to keep them nice and soft so they sit back in the scene. I like to do the reflections at the same time while the colour is still fresh, just mirroring the shape loosely and softening the edges a little as I go. Making the reflections a little darker. I'm switching to a smaller brush now, it's a size 3, and using the same alizarin crimson and intense blue mix to add a few gentle ripples to the water. Just keeping the strokes horizontal and light so they hint at movement without pulling too much attention. I've started working on the second mountain on the left. It's a little closer than the last one. I'm being careful not to let the wet paint touch the mountain on the right, just to keep those edges clean and avoid any colours bleeding together. I'm mixing up a bit more pigment, mostly alizarin crimson with some water and a tiny dot of intense blue to deepen the tone slightly. While that dries a bit, I'm adding a few more ripples using the small brush. Same gentle strokes, keeping them nice and horizontal. Mixing up another puddle now. Alizarin crimson again with a bit more intense blue this time to make a slightly cooler, darker mix. I'm working on the mountain on the right and I'm leaving a bit of space between it and the previous one so the colors don't run into each other while they're still wet. For the reflection, I'm leaving a thin white line between the base of the mountain and the water. It helps create that soft separation and a sense of stillness. Adding more intense blue for an even darker mix and painting in the small island on the left. I find painting so relaxing. It's one of my favorite pastimes. There's just something about watching the colors flow across the paper that feels really calming and unhurried. I've let the paper dry again before moving on, just to keep the edges clean. Now I'm mixing up some more alizarin crimson with water to paint the furthest mountain and its reflection, keeping it fairly light and soft. I'm still being careful to leave that thin white strip between the mountain and the water. It really helps with the sense of separation. I'm also darkening parts of the water just a little. I'm mixing up a slightly lighter version of the color I used for the island on the left, just a bit more water to soften it. With that, I'll start painting the next mountain. It's still fairly subtle, so it sits nicely in the distance without overpowering the scene. Adding another layer of color to darken it a bit. Adding a bit more alizarin crimson to paint our last mountain. Almost forgot to leave that thin strip of white. Adding more intense blue to darken the mix. This area needs slightly more defined edges, so I'm just using the very tip of my brush to sharpen a few lines. Adding a little more intense blue for the reflection. I think, deep down, I'm more of a mountain girl. I've always found myself drawn to the lakes and mountains. There's something about the stillness of the water paired with the strength of the mountain that feels so grounding. I love the way the light changes across them during the day and how the reflections seem to hold an entire world of their own. Painting scenes like this feels a little like bringing that calm, fresh air indoors. It's a reminder of places I'd like to visit and moments I like to hold on to. Not again. What can I say? I think I'm just in love with that intense blue, frequently getting a lot more color than I really need. Let's try that again, hopefully not so heavy-handed this time. That's so much better. Drying the paper once again. I'm darkening the foreground mountain now, just adding a bit more intense blue to the mix to deepen the tone. As I go, I'm also adding a little texture with the brush. Nothing too detailed, just enough to hint at some movement and shape in the landscape. Now I'm switching to a number 2 brush and using Payne's Grey to start adding some trees. These are just simple silhouettes. I'm keeping the shapes loose and natural, using upward strokes to suggest trunks and branches without too much detail. The trees in the reflection are even looser, just soft shapes to suggest their form without pulling focus. Using Payne's grey and the same brush, I'm going to add in a few more trees. I always seem to struggle a little with painting trees. I can never quite decide how much detail to put in or how loose to keep them. It's one of those things where some days it flows easily, and other days it feels like I'm overthinking every branch. What about you? Does painting trees come naturally, or do you find them a bit tricky too? I think the challenge is also part of what keeps it interesting. There's always another way to suggest shape and texture without getting too caught up in the tiny details. I've noticed I work best when I don't rush. Watercolour has its own timing. Sometimes you have to wait for the paper to dry. Other times you need to work quickly while it's still damp. Learning to listen to that has made painting so much more enjoyable. Often, when I paint, I start with a quick and simple pencil sketch of whatever's in my mind. It's not detailed, just enough to capture the main shapes and layout. Then I transfer this to the watercolor paper and try to bring it to life with paint. It doesn't always turn out exactly how I pictured it, but more often than not, it's not too far from the image in my mind. And sometimes it even surprises me in a good way. We are on the home stretch now, just adding our last tree and then a few final details before we're done. Tips and self-reflection is coming up next. Thank you so much for sticking with me, whether you've been painting along or just watching. I hope you've enjoyed this process as much as I have. There'll be more videos like this to come, so if you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep making more of these videos. I'm using a white uniball here to add a little separation between the water and mountains and to pop in a few sparkles across the surface. When working with darker colors, I find it's best to use them very sparingly. They can quickly take over if I'm not careful. I also realized I should have waited for each layer to fully dry before starting the next. I worked on the mountains in sequence from the faintest to the darkest. That would have helped keep the depth more natural. A bit more texture on the other mountains would have added interest too. And for the trees, I think mixing another color in with the Payne's grey would have given a touch more variation and a hint of light. But that's the beauty of painting. Every piece is a little lesson for the next one. I can't help myself. This island really needs to be a bit darker with some extra texture. Just deepening the tone here and adding a few rougher brush strokes helps it feel more solid and stand out in the scene. Thanks for sharing this painting time with me. Until next time, may calm skies and quiet reflections stay with you.